In looking at overcoming sin, we need to understand the process of a temptation. Over in James chapter 1, starting in verse 14, it says, "But each one is tempted by his own desires while being baited and enticed." Verse 15 then goes on to say, "Then when the desire conceives, it births sin, and sin, when it is brought to completion, produces death." So what we have here is the actual process by which a temptation comes. First, we get the desire. It's presented to us. At this point, we are not unrighteous and we have not sinned. We have a desire that comes into our minds. It can come in from a lot of different areas where it can be obviously something that's enticing to us. Otherwise, we wouldn't even really give it much thought. Now, at this point, we can and should be weighing every desire that comes into our minds and deciding whether or not it lines up with who we are in Christ or not. And if it doesn't line up with who we are in Christ, we need to reject it, identify where it's coming from, and put on the proper defense. For the sin nature, it's know, reckon, and yield. For Satan, it's putting on the armor. For the world system, it's recognizing the fact that we are dead to the world system. In Christ, we've been separated from it. Yes, we live in it, but we're not out from it, which means we shouldn't be seeking to fulfill its desires. We use it, but we don't abuse it. So you have a desire, and that temptation baits you. It draws you out of your safe place, and it gets you to bite. Now, once you accept it as your own, that is, you accept it in a way to where it is something that you have determined you will actually do, you will fulfill, you are now unrighteous. Unrighteousness is not the same as sin. Unrighteousness is a bigger term. It also involves what is going on in our mind. We're still at a stage where we can actually take the way of escape. We haven't sinned. We haven't actually produced the action yet. But we are in a state to where we have determined we're going to do it when the opportunity comes about. The next stage is actual sin. This is when that desire that was conceived within our mind, because conception is where you've trespassed. You've gone into an area where you don't belong. You're not taking God at his word, and you're not putting up the proper defense. Once it has conceived, it births sin. Sin is always exterior to the body. It's always an action. That means that we have chosen to reject what God's standard is for us and to do the desire that we know is contrary to that. Remember, for a Christian, sin is actually doing anything not out from faith. Well, not out from faith, because faith is always based upon a promise. It means we're looking at a situation and we're not choosing to do what God actually wants us to do. We're going contrary to that, knowing that we're violating what his expectations of us are. That's what sin is for a Christian. So when we sin, we have basically gone through this process. We've been tempted. We accepted the temptation as our own and determined to do it. We then fulfilled it. Now, until we actually fulfill it, we haven't actually sinned. And fulfilling is performing the action. Up to that point, we can take the way of escape. So when we have sinned, what we've done is we've broken fellowship with God. Remember, there is no darkness in God. There is no manifestation of the sin nature in God. And when we're manifesting the sin nature, we are not sharing anything in common with God. And we need to restore that fellowship. See over in 1 John chapter 1 and verse 9, that restoring of that fellowship involves us confessing our sin. That is agreeing with God that our action is sin. God is then going to forgive us of that sin, and he's going to cleanse us not only of the sin, but also of the unrighteousness. But remember, unrighteousness is the bigger term. Just before James talks about the process for temptation, he makes a statement that I think is really important for us to remember. He says, "Happy is the man that endures a temptation." Not all temptations, but a temptation. Because having become approved, he will receive the victor's crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. James chapter 1 and verse 12. We can overcome temptation, but we need to take the way of escape. We need to give consideration to what is coming into our minds. Weigh it against who we are in Christ. And start rejecting those things that involve the desires from Satan, from the flesh, or even from the world system. And start doing those desires that actually come from the Spirit. The desires that involve living out a life of righteousness. The desires that are actually from God, that are well-pleasing to him, that ultimately end in us actually being happy. A true happiness, being content in any situation. Because this is part of our salvation. God has actually given us everything we need to live a life of godliness, to live a life of righteousness. We just need to take him at his word and start applying it. And the end result is we will be ones who are happy.